This is Dr. Mark, animal advocate, longtime animal rescuer, author, investigative journalist, and former deputy sheriff. Let's have a serious discussion. Local governments, law enforcement, and the judicial system have failed, miserably, in their duty to protect the voiceless. Shelters are turning into slaughterhouses, and why? Because those in power refuse to implement real solutions. Every single dog on this euthanasia list represents a preventable tragedy, a life discarded because of systemic neglect, apathy, and broken policies. Local governments, law enforcement, and courts love to hide behind the same pathetic, worn-out excuses. We don't have the resources, we don't have the manpower, animal issues aren't a priority. These are nothing but lies. Weak, lazy justifications for a complete failure of leadership. If you can hire deputies to sit on the side of the road writing traffic tickets, you can hire reserve deputies to enforce animal laws. The cost is minimal, but the impact is massive. The reality is you don't want to do the work. Your ignorance of running an office is overwhelming. You fail to see the clear, proven link between animal abuse and violent crime, domestic violence, drug activity, and child abuse. The FBI tracks animal cruelty for a reason. It's a red flag for dangerous criminals. Yet you choose to ignore it. By refusing to take animal abuse seriously, you allow violent offenders to escalate. You waste resources reacting to crimes instead of preventing them. You fail your duty to protect the community. This isn't about money or manpower, it's about pure incompetence. If you don't have the leadership skills to implement basic, effective animal services, you should not be in office. To the public, enough is enough. Demand that your officials hire reserve officers or task forces to enforce animal laws, prosecute animal cruelty cases aggressively, fund low-cost spay, neuter, and community rescue efforts, and recognize that animal abuse is a public safety issue. If they refuse to act, vote them out. Inaction is complicity. No more excuses, no more innocent lives lost. Law enforcement. You enforce laws selectively, ignoring animal cruelty, and failing to protect the innocent. Where are the arrests for animal abandonment, neglect, and abuse? Your refusal to take these crimes seriously has fueled the shelter crisis. Leaders of law enforcement, you are incompetent. Courts. You let abusers walk free, handing out meaningless fines instead of real punishment. You allow backyard breeders and irresponsible owners to keep exploiting animals with no consequences. The district attorneys, prosecutors, and court system have failed animals in the worst way possible. They are directly responsible for the ongoing cycle of cruelty, neglect, and mass euthanasia because they refuse to enforce the law with real consequences. Every time the court gives an abuser a slap on the wrist, a meaningless fine, probation, or a dismissed case, they send a clear message: animal lives don't matter. Abuse is not a real crime. Go ahead and do it again, because nothing will happen to you. Where do we get these people? Who appoints our court officials who care nothing for life? How did we end up with judges and district attorneys who treat animal abuse as a nuisance instead of a violent crime? These people are unfit for their positions. They let serial abusers walk free. Studies prove that animal abusers often escalate to harming humans. Yet these prosecutors let them go with laughable punishments. They won't fight for felony charges. In states where animal cruelty can be charged as a felony, prosecutors choose not to pursue it. Instead, they reduce charges down to misdemeanors, making the punishment meaningless. They refuse to set legal precedents. When they have the chance to create strong legal precedents for animal protection, they cave. Instead of pushing for maximum sentencing, they settle for deals that embolden abusers. They don't care. It's that simple. To them, animals are not important enough to fight for. The job of a prosecutor is to seek justice. Justice is not letting an abuser walk free. Justice is not handing out a small fine to someone who tortured an animal. Justice is real punishment, real consequences, real deterrence. Start enforcing felony animal cruelty charges. Demand maximum sentences. Fight for better laws and tougher penalties. Recognize animal abuse as a public safety crisis. If they won't do their job, they need to step down or be voted out. The public deserves prosecutors who will fight for justice, not cowards who let criminals go free. No more excuses, no more failures, no more innocent animals suffering because of the incompetence of the court system. Local governments, You are the worst offenders of all. You cut funding for shelters, refuse to implement spay-neuter programs, ignore ordinances that could prevent overpopulation, and treat shelter pets as disposable. Local government officials, mayors, council members, parish officials, you are to blame. You sit in your offices making decisions that shape your community, yet you refuse to lift a single finger to protect the most vulnerable beings under your watch. Your failure is written in the blood of every innocent animal that dies because of your inaction. In far too many areas, local governments won't even take the simple step of enacting basic animal welfare laws. Why? Because they don't care, it's not a priority. They dismiss the issue as unimportant while their shelters fill up and rescues beg for help. In far too many areas, local governments won't even take the simple step of enacting basic animal welfare laws. Why? Because they don't care. It's not a priority. They dismiss the issue as unimportant while their shelters fill up and rescues beg for help. It takes almost nothing to pass meaningful ordinances. Anti-tethering laws to prevent animals from being chained 24/7. Mandatory spay and neuter programs to reduce overpopulation. Stricter penalties for animal abuse and neglect. Funding for animal control officers who actually enforce the laws, yet they refuse. Instead, they let their communities become dumping grounds for the unwanted, the abused, and the abandoned. They choose not to act, and their inaction is a direct cause of suffering. Yet, they refuse. Instead, they let their communities become dumping grounds for the unwanted, the abused, and the abandoned. They choose not to act, and their inaction is a direct cause of suffering. When animal advocates demand funding for shelters, animal control, and rescue efforts, these local officials act as if there's no money available. But let's look at the facts. There's money for unnecessary office renovations, there's money for pet projects and political favors, there's money to pay bloated salaries for officials who do nothing. But when it comes to funding life-saving efforts for animals, suddenly the well is dry. At best, they allocate scraps, a bare minimum effort just so they can claim they did something. It is disgusting, it is shameful, it is unacceptable. When local government officials fail to act, they are directly responsible for every animal that suffers and dies. You may not have pulled the trigger, but you helped kill the animal. You may not have injected the euthanasia drugs, but you made sure the animal had nowhere to go. You may not have abandoned the dog on the street, but you ensured there was no safety net to save it. Your lack of concern makes you complicit. You have blood on your hands. And the worst part? It doesn't seem to affect you at all. You will answer for your sins. Maybe not today. Maybe not in this life. But you will answer for your indifference. Whether it's in the next life, before your maker, or in the court of public opinion, your failure will be remembered. The suffering you allowed will be judged. But here's the truth. You still have time to change. Start prioritizing animal welfare. Pass real enforceable animal protection laws. Fund proper animal control and shelter services. Stop pretending you've done enough when the bodies of innocent animals say otherwise. If you don't, history will remember you not as leaders, but as cowards who stood by and did nothing while innocent lives were lost. The time to act is now. No more excuses, no more failures. Do your job or step aside for someone who will. But the failure isn't just on the system, it's on society as a whole. But the failure isn't just on the system, it's on society as a whole. People have failed just as miserably. Too many see abuse and do nothing. Too many hear the cries of suffering animals and look the other way. Neighbors ignore the starving dog chained outside in the heat. Families dump their pets like garbage because it's too much work. Witnesses stay silent instead of reporting abuse because they don't want to get involved. This is why shelters are killing. Because animals keep coming in, and too few people care enough to stop the cycle before it reaches this point. If more people reported abuse, fought for stronger laws and supported rescues, we wouldn't have lists like this. This is your failure too. Every person who ignored suffering, every official who refused to act, every court that let abusers go free, you are responsible. To every citizen reading this, speak up, hold your officials accountable, demand no-kill policies, increased funding for TNR, and harsher penalties for neglect. If they refuse to listen, vote them out. Animals deserve better. The system must change now. Local governments, law enforcement, and the court system, you have failed. You have ignored the suffering, dismissed the cries for help, and turned a blind eye to the horror unfolding in your own communities. Your negligence has directly led to the mass killing of innocent animals. Local governments, law enforcement, and the court system, you have failed. You have ignored the suffering, dismissed the cries for help, and turned a blind eye to the horror unfolding in your own communities. Your negligence has directly led to the mass killing of innocent animals. How much more blood will be spilled before you take responsibility? How many more innocent lives must be lost before you wake up and realize that your inaction is the problem? The excuses of no resources, not enough manpower, or not a priority are nothing but cowardly cop-outs from people who lack the will to do what is right. If you cared, you'd find a way. How much more blood will be spilled before you take responsibility? How many more innocent lives must be lost before you wake up and realize that your inaction is the problem? The excuses of no resources, not enough manpower, or not a priority are nothing but cowardly cop-outs from people who lack the will to do what is right. If you cared, you'd find a way. You have the power to stop this. You have the ability to create laws, fund programs, and enforce justice, but instead, you choose apathy. You choose to let defenseless creatures die because it's easier than taking action. Your hands are stained with their blood, and history will remember you for what you failed to do. This is not just a failure, it is a betrayal of your duty as public officials. You swore to uphold justice, yet you have abandoned the most vulnerable among us. But make no mistake, you will answer for this cruelty. Whether in this life or the next, there will be a reckoning for those who stood by while innocent animals suffered and died. This is not just a failure, it is a betrayal of your duty as public officials. You swore to uphold justice, yet you have abandoned the most vulnerable among us. But make no mistake, you will answer for this cruelty. Whether in this life or the next, there will be a reckoning for those who stood by while innocent animals suffered and died. The time for silence is over. The time for action is now. Either step up and do your job, or step aside for those who have the courage and compassion to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. No more excuses, no more failures, no more death.